So hello and welcome everyone to today's stream. We'll wait another minute or two to allow everyone to join, and then we're happy to kick off today's episode. So keep calm and see you in a minute. All right, so let's kick off today's webinar. Welcome, and we're super happy to be back with the second episode of our Bicep series today. And of course, we hope that many of the attendees from the last episode 2 weeks ago came back today to learn a little bit more about Bicep. And today we'll mainly focus on parameters and functions. This is the official title of today's stream. But we also added some additional bonus content, especially for the attendees today. So before we kick off, two more things. First, if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A section on the right-hand side. Ask your questions, and we're happy to answer those either during the presentation or at the very end. We still have like 10 to 15 more minutes to have a conversation. And then second, the session will be recorded, and we'll make that session available as soon as possible after the webinar. All right, so let's start with the quick introduction. So Martin.
Yeah, thanks, Marcel. Grateful to have yet another session with you. My name is Martin Ernst, and I work for a company based in Norway called Vips. So we are a payment service provider, basically, for merchants and P2P payments, person to person, and that kind of stuff. So we are fully flown in Azure. So that's why I'm here today. Apart from that, I do race some cars and ski during the winter. So over to you, Marcel.
That's good. Happy that winter is coming very soon, at least in Norway. All right. Yeah. My name is Marcel. I work for SoftwareOne. We are a technology services and software lifecycle management company operating worldwide. Myself, I'm located in Switzerland. And I will do all the talking today while Martin has the much more fun part and will take care of all the live demos. All right, so let's start right away with the first topic we want to cover, which is parameters. So 2 weeks ago, we demonstrated, or Martin demonstrated, how we can deploy resources using Bicep. So how you actually describe a certain resource. And when you describe a resource in Bicep, you can, of course, hard code all the specific values for your service inside the code, or you can choose another way or another approach, which is to parameterize your deployments. And the cool thing if you parameterize your deployments is that this makes your code reusable, because our ultimate goal is to maintain as few code as possible and to reuse our code that deploys a certain service all the time. But of course, we need a way to somehow submit different values for all the deployments. So as an example, if I deploy a BI platform today, I might use other values compared to another BI deployment I will do tomorrow. But if possible, I want to use the same code that actually describes my environment so that I can reuse that code every time. So this is why parameters are there, and parameters are resolved before, or let's say during deployment. So whenever we start a deployment, we are asked to submit values for our defined parameters, saying, all right, now I need a name for your whatever storage account or for your SQL database and so on. Please submit a value now. And those values can be submitted either on the command line, or you can also have, especially if it's lots of parameters that you are using, you can have a parameters file that holds like all of the different values that you want to submit for the specific deployment. And that also gives you, for instance, a way to easily define parameter files that you use with the same code, where one parameter file, for instance, has all the values that you use in your dev environment, while the other parameter file that works with the same code has all the values for your production environment. So parameters are defined or declared using the parents keyword, and after that, you need to submit a name. So every parameter needs a unique name. Unique means you cannot have another parameter with the same name, and you also cannot have other objects in your Bicep configuration. For instance, a variable that uses the same name. So the name needs to be unique. And you also need to instruct Bicep what data type you want to use for that specific parameter. So if it's a string that you want to submit, or if it's an integer or a bool value, or maybe a larger object that contains multiple values, or maybe even an array that contains multiple values, or even multiple objects. So it really depends what you want to submit. Something as easy as a string, or a thing that's more complex, such as an array. And then what's also important is that you can use so-called decorators to then configure your parameters. If you have a complex deployment, you might easily discover that if you didn't write the code yourself, it's pretty hard sometimes to follow what the different parameter means, right? And this is why you, for instance, can add a description decorator, which means you can add a description that describes what this parameter is used for. And this description will live in the code, so right beside the parameter definition, so you have access to it all the time. Depending on your parameter, you could also, for instance, define the allowed values. So for instance, if you deploy an Azure service that offers various different SKUs, you can add the allowed SKUs that you want to allow, or that the Azure platform accepts as allowed values. So that if you later submit a different value, which would not make any sense to the Azure platform, this would not be accepted. You can have default values, so that when you do not specifically submit a value for a parameter, the default value is used. Again, that helps us to reduce our code. And then you can also have length and value constraints. For instance, if you know, well, I need to submit a string, but the string can only be can only have a max length of, let's say, 15 characters, because otherwise the deployment will fail in Azure. Then we can already define that in the decorator. And also very important, you can mark a specific parameter as a secure string or a secure object, which means that the value is not shown in any deployment log. So let's say you need to submit some password or shared secret or something, then you can mark that parameter as secure, and then the value will never be used in some output or in some log file. And then finally, if you want to use a parameter, once it's declared, you can see this right here on top. So this is the parameter, and up here you have the decorators, which is in this case a description and the allowed values. You can then use the two parameters here, location and name, by just defining what parameter you want to use, in this case, to deploy a storage account. You just reference to the name of the parameter, and then you're good to go. This is why these names need to be unique in the Bicep configuration. All right, then a second thing that's important to understand is variables. Sometimes a bit confusing because it sounds like the same thing as a parameter, but it's actually not. So a variable is something that makes our deployments easier, especially if we want to somehow calculate values before we use them. So imagine you submit a value by a parameter, but then you cannot use this value directly, but you first want to add something. You want to concatenate the final value based on certain parameters that you selected, or things like that, or use like some more complex functions. Then you can do that in the variables section. Variables are used to construct values that we will use normally multiple times in the Bicep configuration file, so that we don't have to have a complex construction definition multiple times in the Bicep code. Right. So we do that once in the variables section, and then we can access the variable value that has been calculated for us. Again, this thing needs a unique name. It's declared by the var keyword. It doesn't need any type of data. Well, you don't need to define the data type. That's automatically defined based on the value you're constructing in there. And if you want to use variables afterwards, you again just use the keyword, in this case, the full name, and then you just access the full name in the resource configuration. So exactly the same way that you can access parameter values. Now you can see here a thing that I quickly want to mention, which is now somehow concatenating two values. So one is storage as a string, and then second is dollar parentheses name, which is then the value that has been submitted as a parameter value. So this method is called interpolation, which means that we're actually using a value from some other element to construct this variable in this case. Right. Okay, then next is output. It might be needed that after the deployment happened, you return some values. And outputs are defined by the output keyword. They again have a name, a type, and then finally a value. And this is important for two reasons. So first, as an admin or as a developer, I just might be interested in some values, maybe especially in some values that have automatically been created for me, right? And then I can just output those values so that I can see the values that, for instance, the Azure platform has assigned for me. Second, and maybe more important, is the fact that I might use those output values to describe other resources. So that means I can use an output value and then use that again as a value to deploy another resource. So for instance, if I create, let's say, a database, I could output the connection string to the database and then use that connection string when I deploy the next resource, which could be an application in Azure that might need the connection string to make that database accessible. So with that, you can transport values from one resource to another. All right, then also a thing to understand is operators. So when you want to calculate values, when you want to compare values, those kind of things, then there's lots of different operators available in Bicep. So some of them are pretty obvious, such as these guys here. They're used for subtracting, multiplying, dividing, and so on values. Here, this is more for comparison, where you say, well, I want to compare if one value is larger than another or has the same value and so on. And of course, brackets are used to evaluate values and prioritize. Right? So you can see a simple example down here. For instance, I defined an output, which is a bool, and I said, well, if the length of the storage account name is larger than 20, then this would result in a true. And if it's smaller than 20, it will result in a false. Not very meaningful, honestly. It's just a simple example how this could be used. All right. Now, a very important thing that we can use in Bicep are so-called functions. And there's a lot of different functions available in Bicep that make our life much easier. So functions can be used in variables. So to calculate a variable value, we can use functions directly for constructing resources, property values, or also in outputs. So if you have a look at this example here, you can see that I'm constructing a variable name, full value, which consists of a string, which is a storage account, and then I'm using this function here, which is which is unique string, which means please generate some unique string based on some inputs. And the inputs here is in brackets. In this case, I will use the resource group ID as an input, which means whenever I deploy this code to the same resource group, which obviously always have the same resource group ID, unique string will generate a value out of this, and that value will always be the same. So the result of this variable calculation will be storage, and then, for instance, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And whenever I deploy that code to the same resource group, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 will always be the same. However, if I deploy this to another resource group, the value or the result of the unique string will be different because the resource group ID will obviously be different, right? So these functions can really make your life easier, and you need to understand a little bit what functions are available. And there's actually lots of functions available, lots of functions of different types. So I just quickly summed those up. I will not go into all the different functions. They are very well documented, but let me maybe pick some of these. So for instance, if we talk about managing arrays, if you have, for instance, an array parameter, you can then check, well, is the array empty, for instance, or does the array contain like certain values that I'm interested in? What's the max value that lives in an array? Or for instance, the union function that allows me to union two arrays, so to actually glue them together. Or date functions. If I need the current time in UTC, for instance, I could use this function. Or maybe let's also go down to the string functions. Down here, I could, for instance, use the split function to split a certain string because I only want to use a part of this this string. Or I could use the toLower function just to ensure that a specific value is changed to all lowercase characters in case I would have submitted uppercase characters. Or I could trim a string after a certain element. I could trim the string in the beginning or in the end, for instance, just to pick some of these examples. And you can see there's many of them. Actually, there's a little bit more than just these, but definitely make sure that you understand those. Especially these here are of importance, and that we will dive a little bit more into these two functions in the next episode, which is reference and resource ID, where reference, for instance, is one way to reference to an already existing resource that lives in the Azure platform. So for instance, if you want to connect some resource that you're deploying and that resource needs well, some information from an already deployed resource that lives on the Azure platform already, then you could use that function. So lots of functions available. Have a look at the documentation to understand how they actually work. And the very last thing is something called loops. It does exactly what it says. So it allows you to create loops that deploy multiple instances of a specific object type. For instance, if you need 10 storage accounts, there's no need to describe the storage account 10 times because the code will always be the same. So then it's better to loop through that code saying, well, I want to have 10 of these instances, but then maybe there's some parameters that might change for the different instances, such as the name. And then we can submit, let's say, 10 names in a variable or in a parameter, and then just use one code segment to deploy the same code 10 times with different parameter values, such as the name, for instance. So it's actually really a very basic looping function. All right. Enough talked. Now it's time for the live demo. So Martin, please take over.
All right. Thanks, Marcel. Let me just pull up my screen. So that was a lot to cover. Actually, Marcel, I didn't know that you had that much in your slides, but let's see if I can replicate some of these in the demo.
I know you will.
Are you prepared? Is that what's going on?
Yep.
Good. So these sessions that we have, Marcel, they are scheduled to 30 minutes plus. So we cannot cover everything around Bicep and parameters and functions, like you said. It's primarily this session are for you, the audience, to go home and learn even more. So what we are looking at today is the parameters and some of the functions that are available in Bicep. So the first thing we did, let's just take a quick look at where we left off 2 weeks ago. So then we had this demo where we had a parameter just called storage account name. That's okay for simple deployments or one-off deployments or not sharing templates and so on. But if we work in a larger company where we, for example, need to share our code, that sounds reasonable. We can use Bicep to have a better control, or use functions and parameters inside Bicep to have better control of how our templates work. So, for instance, after working with Bicep or with Azure for many years now, I know that storage account names are they can maximum be 24 characters long, and I also know that they only support lowercase letters. So in this example, I have set the decorator to be maximum of 24 characters, and I have used this to lower function from the inputted parameter to force any. Typically, you will see that developers use a camel case, for example. That's not supported in the storage account. So everything needs to be a lowercase, and it has to be maximum of 24 characters. That's one thing you can do. So you can manipulate the string and say, I want all lowercase. Now, the second example is a little bit more complex. So I still use the inputted parameter for storage account name, and we still have the decorator for the length. Now we have also added in this input parameter for environment. So, and this has the decorator where we only allow for prod and test. That's the only environment string that we are allowed to put in during deployment. And In my case, we often differ in test and production on what kind of SKUs or what kind of service, the paid service that we use. So I have this example in the variable called storage SKU. So based on my storage SKU, I want to either use premium local redundant storage, or for anything that's not production, in this case, I can use standard LRS. So this way we can reuse our template to allow for multiple environments with different specification. So now I am just referencing here directly the storage SKU variable, and that will, depending on the input, it will say either product test, and then it will be premium or standard. And this also have a sub, kind of like a sub resource. So it's a container, but it's like a storage, not like a storage container, but it is a storage container. And then we have added that here as well. I see a question here myself. Could you please read that to me? Wait, so the question here is when naming a param environment that will hide the function environment. I'm not sure what that means, but Anders, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, and then I can continue with the next demo. Or Marcel, if you understand the question, you can you can try to help me out. So based on the storage queue, like I said, then we can, or based on the environment input, then we can deploy different SKUs to our storage accounts. Now, what I like to do, I know that people use this this variant of controlling how our resources are deployed and what SKUs and so on they use. I tend to have a different approach that I want to show. So now we are getting a little bit more complex. Let's just take a look at what we have in this example here. We still have, no, we have removed the inputted storage name, and I have now placed that into a variable because I will, like myself demonstrated, I want to have this as a unique thing, because not only do we can control like the friendly names and so on with tags, but in this case I want to just force this this prefix str, and then I want to generate a unique string based on my resource group ID. And like myself said, each time I deploy this to the same resource group, the ID or the name of the storage account will be the same. Further, I still have this environment input, but now I have moved I have added some complexity where we have something called a storage settings. This is an object, and inside there I have production and I have test, and then I can define in this object I can define more complexity than I could with the previous example. So now I also have added this containers here. So I want to deploy multiple containers. And guess what? Then we can use the loop function that Marcel also briefly touched upon. cool thing about using these objects for a storage setting is that I am actually using this based on my environment input. So I'm navigating this object called storage settings, and I'm picking out the SKU from there. And we also set these public access. So in test or in production, we do not want to have public access available on our storage account. But for example, if you want that in the test environment, then we can also add that inside here. So then again, we navigate the object based on our environment, and then we pull out this information here. And for the looping part, then we just iterate over the same object based on the environment. And then we have the containers here. So for each name of containers I have defined here, I want to run the loop and place it in the same storage account that we have. So now we are referencing the storage account and we are using the container name. So now if I am going to run this, I can do like this. So I want to run demo3.bicep. And the only input that I will need to pass is my environment. If I run test, and then move up to this Azure portal with my looking at the deployments, we will see that I have kicked off a Bicep day 2, which is now deploying. And you can see that the resource is generated all by itself, the resource name. So SDR and this whatever ID Microsoft is creating from my unique ID based on my resource group. And then, of course, some caching in the portal, then force refresh. And you will see that we have our storage account at some point. Here we are, storage account, and we should have, I used test, so we should have, what was my configuration? Yes, we should have public access enabled. And there we have public access, or here we are, enabled, and we should also have our 2 containers. And we do. So that is what we inputted up here. Run a loop, and we are configuring everything inside this storage account settings object. That was a quick demo of some more advanced stuff that you can do with Bicep. So that's what I had myself. Any questions that you've seen coming in?
Yeah, so there was a question that with the environment parameter name, which is indeed true. So if you select environment as the name for a parameter, I mean, that works, but then you cannot use the environment function later in the code. So because it will tell you parameter names have precedence over function names. So this should be definitely avoided.
Yeah, that's true. I haven't, now I understand once this question is written out a little bit. So yeah. Okay, so that's that was the issue. I haven't run into that issue myself, but as you say, parameters will have precedence from what I know.
Yeah. So that's all. And then there's another question that you can answer, which is, well, what is the default here in the container name?
Aha, okay. So let me just pull up the screen again. So I guess that means this one over here. To be honest, I have cheated a little bit. What you can do instead of adding in the default here is to actually define the blob service itself before putting in the containers. So that will mean that you add in resource. So just quickly see if I can find this. The container is actually a sub-resource of the storage blob service. So you can, if you don't want to string interpolate the name of the containers, then you can add in this blob service instead, and then you can depend on the blob service instead of depend on the storage account itself. So once you want to do more configuration on the storage account or any other services that have multiple subsets of services itself, it could be a good idea to define the service that you're working on. And the default here is something that Microsoft just added from what I believe to know that you're working on the default for blob. If I'm not mistaken, it's quite it's quite strange that they have that as a mandatory when you want to reference that directly. But you don't need that if you define the blob service or the file service or whatever you're using the storage account for in the end.
And maybe it's also better if you go that way for someone else to understand your code.
Yeah, I could definitely improve that. It's I agree. So if you add in the service that you're working on, that will be, or if you're defining multiple services, like I said, if you're not only using blob containers, but also file storage or something like that.
Mm.
So was that all the questions, or?
Yeah, that was everything.
Mm.
Well, thanks for taking the time to answer. Let me go back to the presentation now. Yeah, so we've seen how we can use parameters, how we can use variables, outputs, and so on. We have seen loops in action. We have seen certain functions in action that really makes our code simpler to understand and adds lots of power also to our code. And I'm pretty sure in the next episode in 2 weeks, we will still work a little bit on the parameters and function side. So use more complex functions, because next time we will dive into more complex scenarios, and then we'll definitely come back to functions a little bit. As I mentioned in the beginning, the webinars, all the episodes are recorded. You can find them using that link, so tinycc/infrastructure as code videos. This is how you can get access to all the recordings, and we will also publish the links on the appropriate LinkedIn posts. And we already mentioned last time that there's still this cloud challenge about Bicep going on. So if you register, you can earn badges and also get nice swag. So it's a great initiative from Microsoft Norway. Thanks for making this happen. Definitely have a look at this. The link is already in the Q&A window, so you can grab it from there. And then just as an announcement for the next streams, so in 2 weeks, already mentioned, we'll talk about advanced structures, and we'll also have a look at modules. So we'll see what Bicep modules are and how they can be used. And then again, 2 weeks after, we'll talk about using Bicep in pipeline-based deployments. I think also a very important thing to understand, especially if you work for larger organizations. All right, so that's it from our side. Thanks for listening. We're still here for a Q&A, so if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A window. Other than that, thanks for your time, and we're looking forward to see you again, or to have you again in 2 weeks. Thanks a lot, and enjoy the rest of the day or the evening. Thanks. Bye-bye.